Welcome back everyone. Today we're talking about async, await and promises in JavaScript. In order for us to understand async await, we must know what async stands for. So async stands for asynchronous. And in order for us to understand asynchronous, we must understand what synchronous means. So JavaScript is a single-threaded language, which basically means synchronous code is executed in a sequence. So each statement can wait for the previous statement to finish before moving on. Now, an example of this would be console.log 1, and if I did 2, 3, and I save this, what we're getting is 1, 2, 3 over here. And that basically means it's reading this line, moving on to this bit of code, and then moving on to this bit of code. So these three console logs, they render so quickly that we don't actually see them blocking each other. However, if say line 8 was a significant amount of code, which was hypothetically going away, fetching a list of tweets and then returning back to the user, and this line of code was allowing users to actually click buttons on our website, if we've got to wait for all of the tweets or whatever to be returned and before anyone can click any buttons, then we're going to be in a situation where the website becomes unresponsive. Asynchronous code, on the other hand, doesn't have to wait. It allows your program to move on and continue to run whilst everything else is pending, so in this case our tweets, we've gone off to fetch our tweets, and the code will continue to run below it because it knows that this block of code is asynchronous and it will come back to it. So async is a way to tell JavaScript that a piece of code is waiting for a promise. And I suppose when I was learning at this point, I asked, well, what's a promise? A promise is an object that will return some value at some point in the future. So a promise can be one of three statuses. It can be fulfilled, rejected, or pending. And an example of this would be the tweets example again. So when you go to a website, sometimes what you'll have is fetching tweets. And so that box is doing something in the background, but everything else around the website continues to load. So that is a pending status. If you ever see a status, a box where it says rejected or, could not load tweets or something along those lines, that means the promise has not been fulfilled. And then obviously if you see a bunch of tweets, then the promise has been fulfilled. So it's gone and done some action. It's handled whatever it needs to do, whether it's go away, fetch some data from an API or query a database, whatever it is, and it's returned a response to that promise. And then that promise has handled it in whichever way. If it's expecting some data, it said, okay, we've resolved, or we need to reject this and throw an error. Okay, so to quickly recap, JavaScript is a single-threaded language. It operates in sequence, whereas asynchronous code allows us to operate and move on before finishing blocks of code. And asynchronous code is waiting for a promise to be fulfilled, which can be one of three statuses, which is resolved, fulfilled, rejected or reject, and then obviously pending. So let's create our own promise and then see how we'd handle this with async await. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a quick const and I'm going to call this tweets. And this is going to be equal to a function, and I'm going to set a new promise. So that promise, I'm going to get resolve and reject, as we just mentioned a moment ago, and it's going to do something. So what I'm going to say is there is no error, so let's just say error is equal to false. So if there's no error, then we want to do something. So I'm going to say set timeout and pass in a callback function. And this callback function is just going to call resolve. So what am I going to pass into resolve? Well, let's just pass a tweet. Let's just say ID of 1 and I don't know, the date is today. Okay, so, but if there is an error, we want to reject this and say no tweets available. Now notice I've put the set timeout. What we want to do is just say like this is going to take 2 seconds to actually go and fetch our tweets. Obviously in here we'd have something like going away and fetching some data from an API of some sort. And this resolve and this reject relate directly to our callback here. So let's do something with this promise. What I'm going to do is come down below our promise and say 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to remove the middle line. So we've got 1 and 3. So I have a console log this, I get 1 and 3 over here. Now, with this tweets, because it's a promise, we now get the .den available to us. So once this has been fulfilled, we'll be able to do something afterwards. So .den, and if I say I'm going to get a response which is the data of some sort, so whatever's in here or here will be returned to me, I'm going to say console log data. And I should have said it's only what's going to be returned in from here. This is what we'll handle their errors in a second. So once this has been resolved, whatever gets returned back, we're going to console log it. Now obviously we've set a timeout of 2 seconds, so we're not expecting to get the response straight away. So previously, if we was working with synchronous code, we'd have 1, it would wait to get our response, and then it would move on and do 3, 4, 5, and so on. Now what I'm expecting is 1 and 3, but then at some point in the future, after this promise has resolved, we'll render this block of code. So let's save that. And I've spelled something wrong on line 17, so console log. Oh, it'd help if I... There we go. So we got 1 and 3, and then 2 seconds later, we got a response back, and so it's come back and handled our promise. Now, a minute ago, I mentioned that we had the reject, and we'd handle that. And how we would handle that if I put it on a .catch at the end of it. So I'd say, well, error, do something with the error. So let's just say console.log error. So if for any reason this doesn't resolve, it's going to reject it. And when it rejects it, it passes this in. So this is whatever we call it. So if I said E, we would catch the error of some sort. And just like up here as well, it doesn't have to be called data. It could be called response. It could be called Bob. It could be called anything, but we've called it data. So I'm handling the error, but at the moment there is no error. So let's just say the error is true. So if there's no error, we'll resolve, but if there is an error, then we'll reject it. So error equals true, we're going to reject it. So I'm hoping to get a console log of some sort with an error message here. So I'm going to save this again, and we get no tweets available. So to move this forward, what we can say is, let's create a function and say more tweets. I don't know, we may have to change that name in a second. Now, let's just console.log something here. We started working with the .den, and the reason we had .den available to us, so by .den I mean tweets .den something in here. Obviously that's not syntactically correct, so let's just like something in here, right? We had .den available to us. Now we have that available to us when it's expecting a promise back. So right now, if I said call more tweets and save this, I'm going to get something because we're calling this function. We've ignored this up here, but we're just calling this directly straight away. Now, async await basically tells this function that it will be asynchronous. And by asynchronous, it'll say that I'm expecting a response which I can handle with .den. So, as an example, if I say .den on a function which is not asynchronous and save this, I'm going to get cannot read property of den of undefined. So because it's got no promise, it doesn't have anything. It does, this isn't set up to be synchronous. So for example, something in here, like we can't do anything with this console.log. Let's just write it out. Console.log doesn't work. Now, if I leave this code and I just say at the beginning of this async, now we get something in here, and just to demonstrate that, exclamation mark. So we've not obviously done anything with this function to turn into an asynchronous function. We've just told it that it's going to be expecting a promise at some point in the future. So in order to do that, what we need to do is, I'm just going to delete this and I'm going to change this error back up here to false. So this is kind of our artificial API of some sort, you know, like this, we are returning some data of some sort, or this is where we would go and fetch some data. So our function needs to go off to here and return some data. So we said async. Now what is it going to do? Well, I'm going to say const response is equal to await tweets. So what I'm doing is I'm telling this function that it's going to be there's going to be a promise of some sort, and then the result going into our variable res is going to be waiting for whatever gets returned back from this actual promise up here. So then what we can do is we can say console.log res, and then let's just save this. So wait 2 seconds, and then we get our actual response. Well, you may be asking right now, well, we've got our response, but how do we handle the errors? So that's simple. We can simply wrap this now in a try catch, because we can catch the errors and return them however we want. So what I can say up here is I'm going to put the code that we just had. So we're going to get a response. Let's just change this to get tweets, because that makes a little bit more sense. So get tweets is going to go off to tweets. Then the response is, or the res is going to wait for tweets to return with whatever it is returning, and then it's just going to console log that. But if there's any errors, it obviously needs to skip past this part, and then it needs to go down to this. So what I'm going to say is, let's just change it to error and say, well, let's just console.log errors plus error, and save that. So I've just saved that and refreshed, so we're still getting our response, so that still works. We've got an async and we're waiting for the actual response of our tweets. But if we change this error now to true and that the API failed for whatever reason, we now get no tweets available. So we've still managed to handle our resolve, and we've caught our errors. And as you can imagine, because we've got a promise, or we've turned this into an async to say I'm going to receive a promise at some point, we have .then available to us here. And the reason I'm breaking down onto individual lines here is because it's convention for readability purposes. So I'm going to get the tweets. So I'm going to do something over here, and rather than console login straight away, what I might just do is return response, and I'm going to just return the actual error. So return error. Now, we're not just limited to what we can do in here. We can obviously return quite a bit more. We can say data is await and then do something else here. Obviously we're keeping it simple right now, so we're just returning the response and then we're returning the error. So we've got .then, and what we might say is, well, let's just call this response data, and we have a callback function. So I'm using the ES6 callback functions here, and I'm just going to say console.log and data, and again I can say error or e or whatever, and again callback function console.log and say error. Save this. We get no tweets available because we've obviously set our error to true, so we change this to false, and we get our response after 2 seconds. So that is async await in a small nutshell. I suppose just to recap, again, JavaScript language is single-threaded and it operates in sequence. Asynchronous code allows us to not block other code, so we'll go away, we'll handle some form of data, and we're going to get some values at some point in the future. We come back and then we handle that with a bunch of promises. I hope that makes sense to everyone. If you do have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment down below. But until next time, take it easy.